Hello, everybody. It's me, Jose. And on behalf of everyone here at the Central Park Conservancy, I want to welcome you all on this week's walk. Now, today, in honor of Black History Month, we are going to explore the area around Central Park North, and we're going to examine the nature of community here in what's often referred to as the gateway to Harlem. All right, so again, just before we get started, a few reminders. Now, all participants are muted, but you can use the chat feature to say hello and comment. Now, on the back end of our program for today, we do have Emily, our newest guide. So if you have any questions for her, you can use the Q&A function. Now, the images that you're going to see today were taken by myself just within the past week, but you'll also see some other images, and these are going to be taken from the official archives here at the Conservancy, as well as the New York Public Library, the Library of Congress, and the New York City Parks Department. And of course, our official mission here at the Central Park Conservancy is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. And of course, we've been hard at work since 1980. Now, for our walk this week, I thought we could go and explore a little bit more around Central Park North, also known as 110th Street. Now, if you're a regular on our weekly walks, then you know that we've been on this route many times before. So we're going to walk from west to east and check out landmarks created in honor of Harlem's rich African-American culture, such as the statues of Frederick Douglass and Duke Ellington. We're also going to examine some of the other names historically connected to Harlem and can be found along Central Park's perimeter, like Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Then we're going to end off our tour right at the Charles A. Dana Discovery Center and find out why this section of the park matters so much to so many people in the community. So we'll start off right here at the northwest corner of the park, officially called the Frederick Douglass Circle. Now, even though it had been named after the famed 19th century abolitionist leader since at least 1950, this traffic circle really wasn't completed until about 2010, after decades of planning and construction and engaging with locals. Now, as one of the main entrances in the north end of the park, it of course connects together the communities of Harlem, the Upper West Side, and Morningside Heights. And because of that, the statue is often one of the first things that visitors from these areas see when they first make their way into Central Park. Now, the design of the traffic circle was created by the Harlem-based artist Algernon Miller, who included several references to the Underground Railroad in many of its details. So just behind the Douglass statue is this bronze panel with the constellations etched on it. Douglass, of course, escaped a life of enslavement in Maryland in 1838 by boarding a train bound for the north. So the theme of escaping slavery is, of course, front and center here. In this case, the constellations represent the stars that guided many folks on their journey to a better life. Douglass also published an anti-slavery newspaper called The North Star. So again, etching the night sky here on this panel really is quite appropriate. And right around the perimeter of the traffic circle, you're going to see these wooden wheels. These bring to mind, of course, the wagons and carriages and trains that would be used by enslaved people to escape to the north. Now, here's an aerial view of the Frederick Douglass Circle. From this high up, you might also be able to pick out some of these geometric patterns that are used throughout the monument. So you can see things like triangles, as well as diamonds that basically make up some of the seating, as well as the ground for the park visitors. These are actually a reference to traditional African-American quilt motifs, which were an essential part of Black culture in many households throughout the rural South. Alrighty, and moving on, and we start making our way east from Frederick Douglass Circle towards the main walls of Central Park. And we're gonna head in on the entrance on the left, and we're gonna follow this pathway that parallels Central Park North. Now, as we make our way on down, you might be able to see a little bit of the playground on the right-hand side, just behind all these nice, lovely trees. The northern edges of the park have several areas for kids to play on, and many of them get very busy when the weather is nice. Again, I think it's pretty telling of the heavy usage of this part of Central Park by locals from all around the neighborhood. And just a little further down, we can see this rock outcrop right by the pathway. Now, as we've seen on Ryan's walk last week, the park is, of course, dotted with very, very interesting geological formations, just like this one. This particular one is, of course, pretty smooth and not very jagged. So it can actually be very, very welcoming for folks looking for a nice spot to sit down and just relax. And of course, because it is such a welcoming rock outcrop, it can also attract kids to play on it, like basically any other playground that you'll find here in the north end of the park. Alrighty, and we are moving on. And right now, as you folks can see, we are making our way east along 110th Street, also known as Central Park North. Now, just a few steps further, and we arrive at the corner of Central Park North and 7th Avenue. Now, as most New Yorkers are aware, the city has, of course, a number of streets which have actually multiple names, multiple official names to it. And that, I think, is especially true up here in Harlem, where a lot of city landmarks are going to be named after notable members of the neighborhood's African-American population. In this case, 7th Avenue is also co-named as Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard. Now, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. represented Upper Manhattan in Congress for 26 years, basically from 1945 to 1971. He was, of course, a major force in city politics for more than a quarter of a century, and he would have helped lead Harlem's Black population in the post-World War II era. Today, a statue of Powell can be found just a few blocks north along 125th Street, so right outside of the state office building that was named after him in 1983. So here on this image, you can see him, of course, standing over on the left-hand side, and he's going to be joined by Frederick Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr., as well as the labor leader, A. Philip Randolph. Now, just like Frederick Douglass Circle and the other very, very grand entrances along the north, this cross street really served as a major gateway to Harlem. Now, looking north, we can see the grand apartment buildings that made this part of town so fashionable in the early 20th century. Now, these days in 2022, many of these buildings are still really quite desirable for many folks looking to move to uptown in Manhattan. And that's thanks in part to Harlem's reputation as a vibrant cultural mecca, and of course, its location so close to Central Park. All righty, so right now I want to go ahead and actually pull up our poll of the day. So let me go ahead and pull it up right now. All right, so today I want to actually ask you folks, have you ever visited Harlem before? Now, let us know in the comments or in the Q&A if you've ever spent some time here before. In fact, some of you might actually live here right now. I think it's really one of the more quintessential New York neighborhoods. It's got a very long history with so many interesting restaurants, shops, museums, and residents. I myself actually used to live in East Harlem many, many years ago, so just right off of Central Park. But the area really still has a very special place in my heart. Alrighty, it looks like most folks have finished with the poll, so let me go ahead and share the results. So it looks like something like about 39% of you have visited at least once in your life. And then every once in a while, we have 36% of you that maybe do come here every few weeks, months, whatever it is. And only a very, very small minority of you, just about like 3% actually might live here in Harlem. But it really is kind of a fascinating that we have like just so many folks from around the neighborhood, from around New York City, and of course from all over the planet as well, joining us here on these weekly walks. So it's not just, of course, folks from the local Harlem area, or perhaps the Upper West Side, Upper East Side, wherever it is. All righty, so let's now go ahead and continue on with the weekly walk. And we, of course, are kind of making our way through this northern landscape. Now, as any Central Park fanatic knows, just walking through the park in a cold February weekday morning can really be quite rewarding, since it can be very, very empty at times. And of course, you'll get the whole place just to yourself. And looking up the trees, you might notice a few changes in the air during this time of the year. So for one, many of them are now, of course, starting to bud. as in the case with this otherwise barren-looking ginkgo tree. So just give it a few more months, and it'll, of course, burst in a flurry of green foliage. And of course, if you've ever walked the Central Park North before, I would definitely recommend it. It contains the park's largest collection of ginkgo trees, and it really puts on quite a show in autumn. Now, our next few stops are going to be located along the eastern side of the park. Now, this is where most gatherings occur in the north end, and that's because we're within the vicinity of the very picturesque Harlem Meer and the Charles A. Dana Center, both of which, of course, attract plenty of visitors. Alrighty, so here we are at Lennox Avenue, which also goes by the name Malcolm X Boulevard. Now, this broad tree-lined avenue stretches all the way to 147th Street, and it's most famously known as the beating heart of Harlem. During the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and 1930s, you would have found some of the country's hottest clubs, bars, and restaurants here. And that, of course, attracted some of the leading Black writers, artists, and intellectuals of their day, such as, of course, Langston Hughes. It all starts right here where the street officially meets Central Park. Now, Lennox Avenue was officially co-named Malcolm X Boulevard by the city in 1987, after, of course, the slain civil rights leader. Back in the 1950s and 60s, Malcolm X made his home right here in Harlem, and he would have preached from Mosque Number 7 along 116th Street and Lennox Avenue. And here's an image of what the intersection along Central Park North would have looked like in years prior. So specifically, this is from 1869. For me, this image really is quite fascinating. So whereas today this corner would probably be brimming with all sorts of activity, back then when the park was just newly constructed, Harlem was still the countryside in a far-off corner of Manhattan Island. Lennox Avenue, of course, starts right here at Farmer's Gate, which I think is really quite an appropriate name for it, especially back in the 1860s when they were still creating these naming conventions, considering, of course, the very rural nature of Harlem at this point in time. Alrighty, and continuing on, we can start to see the Harlem Meer itself. Now, this 10-acre water body was essentially built on top of what would have been a swampy area back in the 1860s, hence why it's relatively low and flat compared to the surrounding park land. And of course, it's a nice spot for folks to gather, relax, maybe have a picnic, or even maybe take part in catch and release fishing. The Harlem Meer is, of course, also bordered to the south and west by these rolling hills and woods. So it's pretty popular with photographers and nature enthusiasts too. Of course, humans, we aren't the only ones that enjoy being right by the water. So a variety of wildlife and waterfowl like mallards, mergansers, and shovelers all call it home, in addition to these Canada geese. Now, as so many different species of animals all compete to share the same areas within Central Park, it is important to remember to step back and enjoy the views rather than actively interacting with the wildlife. And signs like these, I think, really help us to keep Central Park enjoyable for all people. Alrighty, and moving on, let's turn back now towards the street at Central Park North. And then we keep heading east along the southern edge of the neighborhood of Harlem. Essentially, we're following the perimeter walls here. Now, as with pretty much every little detail in the park, these stone perimeter walls make a really nice, attractive addition to the landscape. They were basically put up in the 1860s, essentially as a way to block out views of the city around it. So even though they were designed to essentially kind of delineate this boundary between the city and the park, today I think it adds a very nice little touch, and it kind of serves as almost like an extension of the park itself into the city streets. Now, here's a diagram of the stone wall from 1863. What I think is really kind of interesting about this particular diagram is that you can see the different types of stone that was used in the construction process. So right down here at the bottom right corner, you can see materials like New Brunswick sandstone, Hudson River bluestone, and gneiss taken from within the local New York City area. Of course, you can also see the origin, their place of origin as well. So I think this is definitely a neat little diagram to show you folks. Okay, so from here, let's continue on towards our last few stops on the walk. And right at the northeast corner of the park, right where essentially 110th Street meets Fifth Avenue, you can find Duke Ellington Circle, which is of course capped off with a statue of the famous jazz legend. Duke Ellington was born in Washington, D.C., but he's most associated with the nightclubs and music venues of Harlem, New York City, such as the Cotton Club located on 142nd Street. He was, of course, considered to be one of the most famous musicians of the Harlem nightclub scene. So it is quite appropriate that he would have this monumental work of art dedicated to him right here in the neighborhood. Now, I think the layout of the circle really is quite interesting as well, since it feels almost like you're in an open air auditorium with Duke Ellington himself playing a show all for you. Now, the idea of putting up a monument here first came about in 1979, when it was first proposed by the jazz musician Bobby Short. But it really wouldn't be until 1997 that it would actually be completed. In fact, during the opening ceremony for the Duke Ellington statue, there was at least 3 different mayors of New York City all giving speeches during that day. So that would have been Mayor Dinkins, as well as Mayor Ed Koch, as well as other folks as well. And of course, rounding out the musical connections to this corner of the park, we can see the sign noting East 110th Street as Tito Puente Way. This, of course, refers to the Latin jazz pioneer from East Harlem, who is celebrated as an influential figure within New York City's Puerto Rican community. Of course, the presence of both Duke Ellington as well as Tito Puente here really highlights Central Park's long tradition of encouraging music. And of course, these days, you're going to hear musicians play in the park all the time. All right, so back into the park we go. And after walking for a little more than half a block or so through the pathways along the shoreline of the Harlem Meer, we end up right here at the Charles A. Dana Center, which of course is one of our main visitor centers. It's also a really nice place for kind of warm up a bit and kind of chat with our staff during these cold winter months. Just outside the Dana Center, you're going to come to this open plaza with some seating. It opened up to the public after extensive restoration efforts to the Harlem Meer took place in 1993. And ever since then, it's really been the go-to spot for folks in the community to gather and hold any events by the waterside. So in the summer, it's actually the site of the Harlem Meer Performance Festival, which has been a beloved local tradition here since getting its start in the 1990s. It really is a great way to hear local musicians play and take part in any dancing. And of course, folks love it a lot. The plaza also sees lots of activity here every year in October when we organize Halloween events like our annual Pumpkin Parade and Flotilla, where of course we take jack-o'-lanterns that was donated by dozens of people from around the community, and then we put them on these barges and float them out into the water for all to see. It really is a fun activity and a great way to spend an evening out at the park. Now, spending some time taking in the views of the Harlem Meer and the park can be really quite an enjoyable experience. And it's no wonder then that it forms the backdrop of so many community-centered events up here in Harlem. With so much history and culture and music to offer, the north end of Central Park really benefits from its close proximity to such a vibrant and quintessentially New York City neighborhood. All righty, folks, so that does it. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, don't forget to check out our new program next month on the role of women in Central Park. We have both guided and virtual tours available for sign up on our website. Emily is actually going to go ahead and drop those links down in the chat section, so make sure to check those out. And remember, be sure to also follow us on all of our social media channels like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can follow us at Central Park NYC. Now, we're going to go ahead and leave the room open for any last final questions. But from all of us here at the Central Park Conservancy, stay safe. Have a good day, folks.